On the morning of January 12, 1991, 5 people lay dead inside the Tai Tung restaurant at 17 Tyler Street in Boston's Chinatown. All young, all connected to the same gambling network, the method, execution-style shootings, carried out with military precision in front of witnesses who saw everything but said nothing. The perpetrators, 4 members of the Ping An gang, who'd traveled from New York specifically for this moment. The Boston Police Department would later classify it as the deadliest gang-related incident in Chinatown's modern history. But the reason behind the bullets wasn't a drug deal gone wrong, wasn't about controlling territory or eliminating business rivals. It was about a $4,000 gambling debt that went unpaid, and 4 young men who believed that debt, once incurred, demanded payment written in blood. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that shook Boston's Asian American community and exposed the brutal economics of underground gambling networks that operated according to rules written in tradition and enforced with death. Boston's Chinatown in 1991 occupied roughly 46 acres in downtown Boston, bordered by the Massachusetts Turnpike to the south, the Boston Common to the north, and squeezed between the financial district and the red light district known as the Combat Zone. The neighborhood was home to approximately 4,500 residents, though that number swelled to over 20,000 during business hours when workers, tourists, and gamblers flooded in from across New England. The community was predominantly Chinese, with recent waves of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian immigrants creating new tensions in a neighborhood that had always survived through careful negotiation of invisible boundaries. The geography was compact, claustrophobic. Tyler Street ran for just 3 blocks, but those 3 blocks contained the entire universe for many residents. Walk from Beach Street to Neeland Street, and you'd pass 40 restaurants, a dozen import shops, 3 herbalist stores, 2 funeral homes, and at least 7 illegal gambling dens operating behind legitimate businesses. Everyone knew about the gambling. The police knew, the city knew, but Chinatown had always governed itself according to rules that predated American law, rules that came from villages in Guangdong Province and Hong Kong's Kowloon District, rules that said what happened in the community stayed in the community. January 1991 hit Boston hard. The temperature on January 12th was 23 degrees at dawn, rising to only 31 by afternoon, the kind of cold that came off the harbor with moisture in it, seeping through your coat and settling in your joints. Chinatown smelled like roast duck hanging in restaurant windows, incense from temples mixed with diesel exhaust from delivery trucks double-parked on narrow streets. At night, neon signs in Chinese, characters painted the streets red and gold, reflecting off ice-covered sidewalks. You could hear Cantonese opera from third-floor apartments, the clatter of mahjong tiles, the hiss of woks in restaurant kitchens, working until 3 a.m. to feed workers who lived on reversed schedules. But January 1991 wasn't just another cold Boston winter. The city was in economic freefall. The real estate bubble had burst. Banks were failing. The Massachusetts miracle of the 1980s had revealed itself as a mirage built on speculation and corruption. Unemployment in Boston proper had hit 7.8%. In Chinatown, where most work happened under the table in restaurant kitchens and garment factories, the real number was probably double that. When legitimate opportunities contract, underground economies expand. And in Chinatown, the underground economy had always meant gambling. The gambling operations in Boston's Chinatown in 1991 weren't small-time card games. They were sophisticated operations processing hundreds of thousands of dollars weekly. Pai Gao, 13-card poker, mahjong, and most profitably sports betting that allowed Chinese immigrants to gamble on American football, basketball, and baseball games they barely understood but bet on anyway because gambling wasn't recreation. It was religion. It was culture. It was the belief that luck and fate governed everything, and that by studying patterns and making the right bets, you could negotiate with destiny itself. The gambling dens operated with tacit understanding. Restaurant owners rented back rooms for cash. Building superintendents looked the other way. Police received information about robberies and assaults, but not about gambling, because gambling was considered a victimless crime, a cultural practice, something the Chinese had always done. What outsiders didn't understand was that gambling in Chinatown wasn't victimless at all. It was the engine that powered everything else: loan sharking, extortion, prostitution, and the gang structures that enforced debts when luck ran out and fate demanded payment. Nam Huynh was 28 years old on January 12, 1991. Though his Massachusetts driver's license listed him as 32 due to paperwork irregularities common among refugees who'd fled Vietnam in the late 1970s. He stood 5'9", slender, with the kind of build that came from years of manual labor and a diet heavy on rice and vegetables. His most distinctive feature was his hands, long fingers with burned scars from his years working in restaurant kitchens, the kind of scars that told the story of someone who'd started at the bottom and climbed through skill and determination. Nam had arrived in Boston in 1979, one of the Vietnamese boat people who'd survived the crossing from Saigon to Thailand, spent 2 years in refugee camps, and finally secured sponsorship to resettle in America. He was 16 years old when he arrived, speaking no English, carrying everything he owned in a plastic bag. His parents had been killed during the final evacuation of Saigon. His 2 sisters had died during the boat journey. Nam arrived in Boston alone, was placed with a Chinese foster family in Chinatown, and began the process of becoming American while remaining forever Vietnamese. By 1991, Nam had worked his way up from dishwasher to line cook to assistant manager at the Golden Palace restaurant on Beach Street. He made $28,000 a year, worked 70 hours weekly, sent money back to distant relatives in Vietnam he barely remembered. He lived in a studio apartment on Oxford Street, $425 a month, furnished with a mattress on the floor, a hot plate, and a television that got fuzzy reception. He'd never married, had no children, had few friends beyond the network of Vietnamese and Chinese workers who moved through Chinatown's service economy. What Nam valued most was independence. He'd survived everything: war, refugee camps, poverty, discrimination, by never owing anyone anything. He paid his debts immediately. He borrowed nothing. He lived below his means and saved money in cash hidden in his apartment because he didn't trust banks after seeing how the American banking system had collapsed his employer's attempt to expand. Nam believed in work, in building something, in the American promise that if you worked hard enough, you could transcend your circumstances. But Nam had one weakness, one crack in his disciplined facade: gambling. Not casual gambling, not weekend recreation. He was an addict in the clinical sense, someone who couldn't walk past a gambling den without going inside, who'd bet his entire paycheck on a single hand of cards, who believed absolutely in his ability to read luck and control fate. He'd been gambling seriously since 1985, 6 years of wins and losses that mostly netted losses. By January 1991, Nam was in debt to 3 different loan operations for a total of $15,000. Manageable if he stopped gambling, impossible if he continued. He continued. The Tai Tung restaurant at 17 Tyler Street was a mid-level establishment, not the tourist trap that served sweet and sour chicken to white people from the suburbs, but not the high-end banquet hall either. It was a working-class place, open from 11 a.m. to 2 a.m., serving dim sum during the day and functioning as a late-night spot for workers getting off shift. The front dining room seated about 40 people at round tables with lazy Susans. But the real business happened in the back, in a room technically designated for private parties, but functionally operated as a gambling den from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. every night. The back room at Tai Tung had 6 tables, could accommodate about 30 gamblers at capacity. The games were Pai Gow and 13-card poker mostly, with sports betting taking place through a bookie who sat at a corner table taking action on games displayed on a television mounted high on the wall. The operation was run by a man named Wei Chen, 45 years old, who'd been operating gambling dens in Boston's Chinatown since 1983. Wei wasn't part of any gang officially, but he paid protection money to the Ping An organization, about $800 weekly, in exchange for security and the promise that other gangs wouldn't move in on his operation. Nam Huyen had been a regular at Tai Tung's back room since 1988. 3 or 4 nights weekly, he'd finish his shift at Golden Palace around 11 p.m., walk 2 blocks to Tyler Street, and gamble until 2 or 3 in the morning, then stagger home and sleep until his shift started again at noon. He won sometimes, lost mostly. The pattern was consistent: win just enough to believe the next big score was coming, lose steadily enough to slide deeper into debt, borrow to cover losses, gamble to win back what he'd borrowed, lose more, borrow more, repeat until the hole became too deep to climb out of. By December 1990, Nam owed Wei Chen $4,000. The debt had accumulated over 3 months, carefully tracked in Wei's notebook where every bet, every loss, every partial payment was recorded in neat columns. Wei operated on credit because refusing credit meant losing customers to other operations. But credit came with terms: interest at 5% weekly, compounded. Miss a payment, and the interest jumped to 10%. Miss 2 payments, and people came to talk to you about consequences. Nam had made no payments in 6 weeks. The $4,000 had grown to $4,600 with interest. Wei had been patient, had given Nam extensions, had even offered to reduce the interest if Nam would make a substantial payment. But Nam kept gambling, kept believing the next hand would be the one that turned everything around. On December 28, 1990, Wei Chen sent 2 men to Nam's apartment. They didn't threaten him physically, didn't need to. They simply delivered a message: pay by January 10th, or the debt would be sold to people who collected differently. Nam promised to pay, meant to pay. But on January 9, 1991, he took his entire paycheck, $968, to Tai Tung, convinced he could turn it into the $4,600 he needed. By 1 a.m. on January 10th, he'd lost everything and was now in debt for $5,500. Wei Chen had watched the whole thing, had seen Nam's desperation accelerate with each loss, and knew this wasn't ending well. He made a phone call to New York. The Ping An gang had roots in Hong Kong and had established a presence in New York's Chinatown in the early 1980s. By 1991, they'd expanded to Boston, not as a large organization, but as a network of affiliated members who provided enforcement services for gambling operations, brothels, and drug distribution networks serving Asian communities up and down the East Coast. The structure was loose, not like Italian organized crime with rigid hierarchies, but more like a confederation of crews who shared ethnic identity, language, and a willingness to use violence to maintain order in communities where mainstream law enforcement was either absent or unwelcome. David Dai Wong was 24 years old, born in Hong Kong, immigrated with his family to New York at age 12. He grew up in Manhattan's Chinatown, dropped out of high school at 16, joined Ping An at 17. By 24, he'd been arrested twice, once for assault, charges dropped, once for weapons possession, pleaded down to probation. He was smart, disciplined, spoke fluent Cantonese and English, and had a reputation for completing jobs cleanly. When Wei Chen needed someone to handle the Nam Huing situation, he called a contact in New York who recommended Dai and his crew. Dai's crew consisted of 4 members, himself as leader. Tommy Ngo, 22, born in Vietnam, raised in New York, arrested 3 times for various offenses, never convicted. Kenny Lam, 23, born in Brooklyn to Chinese immigrants, had a reputation for being willing to do things others hesitated at. And Mike Tran, 21, Vietnamese, the youngest, the one who still had doubts but suppressed them because loyalty to the crew mattered more than conscience. The job was straightforward. Travel to Boston, collect the debt from Nam Huing. If he couldn't pay in cash, collect in blood as a message to other gamblers that debts in this community weren't suggestions. They were obligations backed by the oldest form of enforcement, violence so extreme it became legend, making future violence unnecessary because everyone remembered what happened when you refused to pay. On January 11, 1991, at 2:30 p.m., Dai Wong and his 3 crew members left New York in a 1989 Honda Accord, drove north on I-95, arrived in Boston around 6:45 p.m. They checked into a cheap motel in Revere, paid cash, used fake names. They had dinner at a Chinese restaurant in Malden, where they wouldn't be recognized, went over the plan one more time, then drove into Boston's Chinatown around 10:30 p.m. The plan was simple. Find Nam Huing at Tai Tung, where Wei Chen said he'd definitely be gambling. Confront him about the debt. If he had money, take it. If he didn't, take him outside, beat him severely enough to require hospitalization. Leave him as a message. Nobody was supposed to die. This was about enforcement, not murder. Debt collection through controlled violence. A beating, not an execution. But plans made in cars rarely survive contact with adrenaline, desperation, and witnesses. At 11:17 p.m. on January 11, 1991, Nam Huing sat at a PAI Gao table in the back room of Tai Tung restaurant, down to his last $45, drinking his 4th beer, exhausted from his shift at Golden Palace and from 6 weeks of mounting dread about what would happen when the collection enforcers finally came. Around him, 30 other gamblers focused on their own games, their own wins and losses, oblivious to the storm about to break. Wei Chen sat at his usual corner table, managing the sports betting, watching Nam with a mixture of pity and irritation. He'd already written off the debt in his mind, had already accepted he'd lose the $5,500. What bothered him was that he'd have to pay someone to collect, and that payment would come out of his own profits. The economics of underground gambling were brutal. You extended credit to keep customers, but credit meant losses, and losses meant paying enforcers, and paying enforcers meant your profit margins eroded until you were working for them instead of them working for you. At 11:34 p.m., 4 young Chinese men walked into Tai Tung's front dining room. The restaurant was mostly empty at that hour, just a few tables finishing late meals. The waitress, a 19-year-old named Susan Lee, approached them automatically. "4 for dinner?" Dai Wong shook his head. "We're here to see someone in the back." He spoke in Cantonese, the language that marked you as part of the community versus a tourist. Susan's eyes narrowed slightly. She understood what the back meant. Understood these weren't customers. "Private party tonight," she said carefully, the standard response to strangers. Dai pulled out a roll of cash, peeled off a 50, handed it to her. "Wei Chen is expecting us. About the Nam situation." Susan took the money, nodded, led them through the kitchen to the back room. The transition was immediate. From a quiet restaurant to a loud, smoke-filled gambling den, 30 men crowded around tables, money and cards and dice visible everywhere, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of beer and desperation. Wei Chen saw them immediately, recognized Dai from a meeting 6 months earlier in New York. He stood, walked over, extended his hand. They shook. Brief conversation in Cantonese, too quiet for anyone else to hear over the gambling noise. "He's there," Wei said, gesturing toward Nam's table. "He's got nothing. Lost his paycheck 2 nights ago. He knows you're coming. I told him. He's accepted it." Dai nodded. "We'll take him outside. No problems in here." "Appreciated." Wei meant it. Violence inside the gambling den was bad for business. People stopped coming when they worried they might catch a stray bullet or witness something that required police involvement. At 11:41 p.m., Dai and his crew approached Nam's Pai Gao table. Nam saw them coming, saw their purpose written on their faces, and felt something inside him break. Not fear exactly, more like the resignation of a man who'd known this moment was inevitable and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. "Nam Huyen," Dai said in Vietnamese, marking him by ethnicity, by the outsider's status that made him vulnerable in this Chinese-dominated space. "We need to talk about your debt. Outside." Nam looked at his cards. He had a decent hand, not great, but playable. If he won this round, he'd have maybe $70. Still nowhere near the $5,500 he owed. He looked up at Dai, at the 3 men standing behind him, and made a decision that sealed everyone's fate. "I'm not going anywhere," Nam said quietly in Vietnamese. "You want to talk? Talk here." The room went silent. Not completely silent. The television still played. Someone at another table still shuffled cards. But the quality of attention changed. Everyone was suddenly aware that something significant was happening, that the social contract governing gambling den etiquette was being violated. Dai's expression didn't change, but everyone who knew him recognized the danger in that stillness. "That wasn't a request. You owe money. We're here to collect. You come outside voluntarily or we take you out. Your choice." Nam shook his head. "You're going to beat me anyway. At least here I have witnesses. At least here, maybe you think twice before you do something you can't take back." It was a gamble, the last one Nam Huyen would ever make. He was betting that public setting would provide protection, that even gang enforcers would respect certain boundaries, that Wei Chen wouldn't allow his gambling den to become a crime scene. He was betting that civilized rules would apply. He was wrong. Kenny Lam, the crew member with a reputation for not hesitating, pulled a 9mm Beretta from his jacket pocket. Not a threat gesture, not waving it around, just pulled it out, aimed it at Nam's head from 3 feet away, and said in Cantonese so everyone could understand, "Your choice was to come outside. You refused. So we do this here." The room exploded. Gamblers dove under tables, pressed against walls, scrambled toward the kitchen exit. Someone screamed. Wei Chen shouted, "No!" from his corner, already understanding this was spiraling beyond enforcement into something that would destroy his business and possibly his life. Nam Huyen stood up, hands raised. "Wait!" Kenny Lam fired once. The shot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, louder than anyone who hasn't been in a room during gunfire can imagine. The bullet hit Nam in the chest, slightly left of center, entering through the 4th rib, tearing through his left lung, nicking his heart, and exiting through his back, continuing through and lodging in the wall behind him. Nam stumbled backward, hit the wall, slid down, leaving a red smear on wallpaper decorated with dragons and phoenixes. His eyes were wide, not with pain yet, but with surprise, with the realization that he'd miscalculated everything. What happened next happened fast. maybe 20 seconds total, though witnesses would later disagree on timing, on sequence, on who did what. Memory doesn't work well during trauma. The brain records fragments, pieces, images without context or order. Tommy No saw Wei Chen reaching for something under his table, assumed it was a weapon, shot him twice. Wei was 45 years old, father of 3 children, had been in the gambling business for 8 years, had never carried a gun because he believed in negotiation over violence. He was reaching for his phone to call for help. The first bullet hit him in the shoulder. The second hit him in the neck, severing his carotid artery. He bled out in under 2 minutes, slumped at his corner table, his betting notebook still open to the page, recording Nam's growing debt. A gambler named Robert Bobby Chin, 34, worked as a cook at China Pearl, had been winning at Pai Gao all night, was up about $600, tried to run toward the kitchen exit. Michael Tran, operating on pure adrenaline and panic, shot him in the back. The bullet entered below Bobby's right shoulder blade, traveled through his chest cavity, collapsed his right lung, and lodged in his sternum. Bobby made it 3 more steps before collapsing face first onto the floor. Kenny Lamb, now committed to eliminating witnesses who could identify them, shot 2 more gamblers who were trying to hide under a table. One was Vincent Wu, 28, who'd immigrated from China in 1987 and worked at his uncle's import business. The bullet hit him in the head. Death was instant. The other was Franklin Young, 42, who'd come to Tai Tung after finishing a shift as a cab driver. The bullet caught him in the chest, but unlike Nam and Bobby and Vincent, Franklin survived the initial impact. He'd live for another 3 minutes, conscious, drowning in his own blood, listening to chaos around him. The 5th victim was Samuel Sam Huang, 31, who wasn't even gambling. Sam worked at Tai Tung as a waiter, had been in the back room delivering drinks when the shooting started. He was hiding behind the bar area when Dai Wong, trying to establish control over the situation, saw movement and fired reflexively. The bullet hit Sam in the abdomen, tearing through his small intestine and liver. Sam would die in the ambulance, 4 blocks from the hospital, holding a paramedic's hand and asking about his wife and 2 daughters who were home waiting for him to finish his shift. 23 seconds. 5 people shot, 4 dead immediately, 1 dying in transit to the hospital. 23 seconds to transform debt collection into mass murder, to cross from enforcement into execution, to create a crime scene so catastrophic it would dominate Boston news for months and haunt Chinatown for decades. Dai Wong stood in the center of the back room, gun still in his hand, looking at the carnage his crew had created. Bodies on the floor, blood pooling on linoleum. Witnesses, maybe 15 people who hadn't escaped, pressed against walls, hands up, faces frozen in terror. He could hear sirens already, distant but approaching. Someone had called 911 within seconds of the first shot. "We have to go," Tommy Ngo said, his voice high and tight with panic. "Right now, Dai. We have to go right now." Dai nodded slowly. They'd come to collect a $5,500 debt and had instead committed what would be classified as multiple homicides, armed robbery, and terrorism of a community. The plan had been a beating. The result was a massacre. The gap between those 2 outcomes represented the distance between being a street enforcer and being a murderer whose face would be on wanted posters in every Chinatown from Boston to San Francisco. At 11:44 p.m., approximately 3 minutes after the first shot, Dai Wong and his 3 crew members ran through Tai Tung's kitchen, out the back door, into an alley off Tyler Street, and disappeared into the narrow streets of Chinatown. Behind them, 5 men lay dying or dead, and 25 witnesses were discovering that what happens in the community doesn't always stay in the community when the violence exceeds certain thresholds. The Boston Police Department received the first 911 call at 11:42 p.m. The caller was Susan Lee, the 19-year-old waitress who'd led Dai's crew to the back room minutes earlier. She was crying, nearly incoherent, speaking in a mixture of English and Cantonese that the dispatcher struggled to understand. Shooting, Tyler Street, Tai Tung, people dead, so much blood. The dispatcher sent every available unit in the downtown area. At 11:46 p.m., 4 Boston PD cruisers converged on Tyler Street, officers approaching with weapons drawn, expecting to find an active shooter situation, expecting to encounter armed suspects, expecting maybe a gang war that had spilled into public view. What they found was worse than active combat. They found aftermath. Bodies sprawled on the floor of a back room that reeked of gunpowder and blood and cigarette smoke. Witnesses in shock, some crying, some catatonic, some pressing towels against wounds, trying to stop bleeding that couldn't be stopped. Franklin Young was still alive barely, gasping for air that wouldn't come, his chest making wet, sucking sounds as his punctured lung fought for oxygen. Officer Patrick Murphy, 12 years with Boston PD, was first through the back room door. He'd worked gang shootings before, had seen aftermath, but never like this. Never 5 victims in an enclosed space. Never this much blood. Never witnesses who looked at him with expressions that said they'd seen hell and survived, but weren't sure survival was worth it. "Jesus Christ," Murphy whispered, then keyed his radio. "We need multiple ambulances at 17 Tyler Street, multiple GSWs, at least 4 DOA, 1 critical. Advise we have a mass casualty situation." Paramedics arrived at 11:51 p.m. They tried to save Franklin Young, worked on him for 8 minutes in the back room before loading him into an ambulance, but he died before they reached Boston Medical Center. Sam Huang was still alive when they loaded him, talking even, asking about his family, not understanding how badly he was hurt. He died at 12:03 a.m., less than half a mile from the hospital, with a paramedic named Jennifer Torres holding his hand and lying to him that everything would be okay. By midnight, Tyler Street was a crime scene spanning 2 blocks. Yellow tape everywhere. Crime scene investigators photographing blood spatter patterns. Detectives trying to interview witnesses who were suddenly unable to speak English or remember anything except hiding under tables. The medical examiner's van waited while investigators documented bodies before removal. News vans from every Boston station had arrived, cameras recording the chaos while reporters struggled to understand what had happened, in a community that typically handled its own problems without involving outsiders. Detective James Doyle caught the case. He was 44 years old, 22 years with Boston PD, currently assigned to the homicide unit working nights. He'd grown up in South Boston, understood ethnic communities and their suspicion of police, had investigated murders in Chinatown before and knew the pattern. Witnesses saw nothing, heard nothing, remembered nothing. The community would police itself. Bodies would be buried. Justice, if it came at all, would come through channels that didn't involve courts or juries. But this was different. 5 dead. In a public place, with at least 25 witnesses. This was too big to disappear, too public to handle internally, too catastrophic for the community to absorb without external intervention. Doyle started with the witnesses. 25 people had been in the back room when the shooting started. By 1 a.m., only 8 remained at the scene. The others had melted away, slipping out through back doors and side entrances, returning to apartments where they'd suddenly remember they hadn't seen anything, hadn't been anywhere, definitely hadn't been gambling at Tai Tung on January 11, 1991. The 8 who remained were either too shocked to run or had decided they owed something to the dead. Doyle interviewed them one by one in Tai Tung's front dining room, taking statements that were remarkably consistent in their vagueness. Yes, there were 4 men. Young, Chinese, or maybe Vietnamese. Yes, they'd argued with Nam Huynh about money. Yes, there'd been shooting. No, nobody could identify the shooters. No, nobody had ever seen them before. No, nobody knew their names or where they'd come from, except Susan Lee, the waitress. At 2:30 a.m., after hours of questioning, Susan broke. She was 19 years old, had been working at Tai Tung for 6 months, was attending Bunker Hill Community College, and trying to save money for her parents, who still lived in Hong Kong. She'd led the shooters to the back room. She'd seen their faces clearly in the dining room light before everything went to hell. "One of them gave me $50, she told Doyle, crying. He said Wei Chen was expecting them. He spoke Cantonese with a Hong Kong accent. He had a scar here." She touched her left eyebrow. Small, maybe from a knife. The others were younger. One was Vietnamese. I could tell from his accent when he spoke. They seemed nervous, except for the leader. He was calm. Doyle had her work with a sketch artist. By 4 a.m., they had a composite drawing of Dai Wong, good enough to work with, detailed enough to circulate. But Doyle knew from experience that a sketch wasn't enough. Chinatown had its own communication networks. If the shooters were from out of town, word would spread through those networks faster than any police bulletin. By dawn, every gang member in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. would know who'd done the shooting and why. The why was almost as important as the who. Doyle spent Saturday, January 12th, reconstructing Nam Huynh's final days, interviewed his landlord, his employer at Golden Palace, his few acquaintances, built a picture of a man who'd survived everything, war, refugee camps, poverty, only to be destroyed by gambling addiction and a debt he couldn't pay. Doyle discovered that Nam had owed money to 3 different operations, total debt around $15,000. The $500 owed to Wei Chen was just part of Nam's problem. His apartment contained evidence of a man in freefall, eviction notice on the door, disconnect warnings from utility companies, nothing in the refrigerator except condiments and a 6-pack of beer. Nam's last paycheck stub showed he'd earned $968 for 2 weeks' work. His wallet, recovered from his body, contained $7. In Nam's apartment, hidden in a box under the bathroom sink, Doyle found a letter Nam had been writing, apparently over several days, never finished. The letter was addressed to his foster family, the Chinese couple who'd taken him in when he arrived in Boston at 16. The letter was in Vietnamese and English mixed together, had to be translated by a community liaison officer. It read, in part, "I know I have disappointed you. I know the gambling has destroyed the person you tried to help me become. I want to stop, but I cannot stop. It is like a sickness in my blood. I believe always that the next hand will be the winning hand, that fate will finally turn in my favor. I am wrong every time, but I cannot stop believing. Now I owe money I cannot pay. People are coming to collect. I am not afraid of dying. I survived so much already. What I am afraid of is that my death will mean nothing, will teach nothing, will just be another Vietnamese refugee who came to America and wasted his chance. Please tell my sisters." The letter ended there. Nam's sisters had died during the boat journey from Vietnam. He'd been writing to dead people. Doyle read that letter at 3 p.m. on Saturday, sitting in Nam's studio apartment that still smelled like the cheap cigarettes Nam had smoked and the fish sauce he'd used to flavor his rice. Doyle had been a cop for 22 years, had read suicide notes and last letters and journals kept by people in their final days. But something about Nam's letter hit differently. The man had known he was going to die, had been writing his own eulogy, had been trying to make meaning out of a life that was about to end because he couldn't stop gambling and couldn't pay what he owed. While Doyle investigated in Boston, Dai Wong and his crew were 200 miles away in New York, sitting in a basement apartment in Manhattan's Chinatown, trying to understand how debt collection had become mass murder. The drive back from Boston had been silent, none of them speaking, each processing what they'd done, what they'd become in the space of 23 seconds. "We're fucked," Tommy Ngo said finally, around 3 a.m. Saturday morning. 5 people dead. Witnesses everywhere. They'll have our faces by tomorrow. We're completely fucked. Dai sat in a corner, hadn't spoken since they'd fled Boston. He was replaying the shooting in his mind, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when control had been lost, when the situation had crossed from enforcement into execution. Kenny had fired first, that was clear. But Dai had been in charge. He'd led the crew. He'd made the decision to confront Nam in the gambling den instead of waiting for him outside. He'd created the conditions for disaster. "What are we going to do?" Michael Tran asked. He was 21, the youngest, the one who'd shot Bobby Chin in the back, and he looked like he was about to vomit or cry or both. "Are we turning ourselves in? Are we running? What's the plan?" "There is no plan," Kenny Lamb said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "We wait. See if they ID us. If they do, we run. If they don't, we stay quiet and hope it blows over." "It's not blowing over," Dai said quietly. 5 people dead. In Chinatown. This is national news by tomorrow. Every cop in the country is going to be looking for us. He was right. By Saturday afternoon, the Boston Chinatown Massacre was front-page news in every major newspaper from Boston to Los Angeles. CNN ran the story every hour. Asian American community organizations issued statements condemning the violence. Boston's mayor held a press conference promising full investigation and justice for the victims. The FBI announced they were joining the investigation due to possible interstate organized crime implications. The sketch of Dai Wong, based on Susan Lee's description, was released to media at 6 p.m. Saturday. By 9 p.m., police in New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco had received calls from informants providing names. Dai Wong, known Ping An associate. Tommy Ngo, Kenny Lamb, Michael Tran, all known associates. Last known addresses in Manhattan's Chinatown, known to work as enforcers for gambling operations. The information came from within the community because even criminal organizations have limits. 5 dead in a public shooting was bad for business everywhere. It brought heat, brought federal attention, brought scrutiny that made normal operations impossible. Better to give up 4 shooters than have entire networks dismantled. The math was cold, but clear. On Sunday, January 13th at 4:45 a.m., FBI agents and NYPD officers raided 4 apartments in Manhattan's Chinatown. They found Tommy Ngo, Kenny Lamb, and Michael Tran asleep in 2 of the apartments. They found evidence, the 9mm Beretta used in the shooting, clothes with blood spatter, the Honda Accord they'd driven to Boston. What they didn't find was Dai Wong. Dai had left Saturday night, knowing informants would provide his name, knowing arrest was inevitable. He'd taken $8,000 in cash, left his apartment with just the clothes on his back, and disappeared. The FBI would search for him for 6 weeks, following leads to San Francisco, Seattle, Vancouver. They'd find nothing. Dai Wong had become a ghost. The 3 crew members arrested Sunday morning were arraigned Monday in Manhattan Criminal Court, then extradited to Massachusetts to face murder charges. They were all denied bail. Their court-appointed attorneys advised them to cooperate, to provide information about Dai Wong's location in exchange for reduced sentences. All 3 refused. Whatever code they followed, Loyalty to the crew apparently superseded self-preservation. The trial of Tommy No, Kenny Lamb, and Michael Tran began in September 1991 in Suffolk County Superior Court in Boston. The prosecution had physical evidence, witness testimony from 8 people, including Susan Lee, and a crime scene so thoroughly documented there was no ambiguity about what had happened. The defense attempted to argue that the shooting had been unplanned, that Kenny Lamb had fired first in panic after Nam Huynh had threatened them, that the subsequent shooting had been heat of passion reaction rather than premeditated murder. The jury of 12 Bostonians, none of them Asian, all of them aware this trial was receiving national attention, deliberated for 2 days. On September 27, 1991, they returned guilty verdicts on all charges: 5 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of armed robbery, unlawful possession of firearms, and conspiracy to commit murder. Sentencing came on October 15th. Kenny Lamb, who'd fired the first shot that killed Nam Huynh, received life without possibility of parole. Tommy Ngo and Michael Tran received life sentences with possibility of parole after 25 years. All 3 would spend their lives in Massachusetts prisons, paying for 23 seconds when debt collection became massacre. Dai Wong was never found. The FBI kept the case open, continued investigating leads for years. In 1995, there was a reported sighting in Toronto. In 1998, someone claiming to be Dai tried to enter the U.S. from Mexico and was detained, but fingerprints didn't match. In 2003, the FBI received information that Dai had died in Hong Kong in 1997, killed in an unrelated gang dispute. The information was never confirmed. As of 2025, Dai Wong remains on the FBI's wanted list for 5 counts of murder, though everyone involved assumes he's either dead or living under a completely new identity in a place far from any Chinatown. The families of the 5 victims struggled with grief that had no outlet, no resolution. Nam Huyn's foster parents held a small funeral. Few people attended. Nam had no family, few friends, had died owing money to people who didn't mourn him. His foster father told a reporter, "Nam survived the war, survived the boat, survived the camps, and then America killed him through gambling. Is that the American dream?" Wei Chin's family held a traditional Buddhist funeral at a temple in Chinatown. His wife stood by the casket with their 3 children, ages 14, 11, and 8, trying to explain why their father had died, why his work in gambling had led to this. There were no good answers. Wei had operated a gambling den because that's what was available, what he knew how to do, what paid enough to support his family in expensive Boston. His death left them with nothing, no insurance, no savings, no income. Within a year, his wife had moved the family back to Hong Kong, unable to stay in a place that had taken everything. Bobby Chin's wife, Angela, was 6 months pregnant when he died. She gave birth to a son in April 1991, named him Robert Jr. after his father. She never remarried, raised her son working 2 jobs, days as a seamstress in a garment factory, nights as a waitress. Bobby Jr. grew up never knowing his father except through stories and the knowledge that his father had died gambling, had been in the wrong place when violence erupted, had left his family alone because he'd been chasing luck that never came. Vincent Wu's parents never recovered. They'd immigrated from China in 1985, had worked brutal hours to bring Vincent over in 1987, had dreams of him taking over their import business. Instead, they buried their only son at 28 years old and spent the rest of their lives asking why. Vincent's father died in 1996, 5 years after the shooting, from heart disease his doctor said but his wife knew was really from grief. His mother lived until 2008, kept Vincent's room exactly as he'd left it, visited his grave weekly until her own health failed. Franklin Young's family, wife and 2 sons, moved to California within 6 months. Boston held nothing but trauma. They wanted distance, wanted to escape the neighborhood where everyone knew what had happened, where walking past Tai Tung's boarded-up windows was a daily reminder. Franklin's wife never spoke publicly about the shooting, refused all interview requests, just packed up her family and left, trying to outrun memory. Sam Huang's death was perhaps the most tragic because Sam had nothing to do with gambling. He was a waiter who'd been delivering drinks when chaos erupted. His wife, Michelle, was home with their 2 daughters, ages 7 and 4, waiting for Sam to finish his shift. He never came home. Michelle sued Tai Tung's owner for maintaining an illegal gambling operation that created dangerous conditions leading to her husband's death. The case settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. Michelle used the money to open a small grocery store in Quincy, raised her daughters alone, never remarried. In a 2011 interview on the 20th anniversary of the shooting, she said, "Sam was a good man, worked hard, didn't gamble, didn't drink, just worked to support his family. And he died for nothing, because other people gambled, because other people owed money, because violence doesn't care if you're innocent." Tai Tung restaurant never reopened. The building sat empty for 3 years, became a symbol of trauma in the neighborhood. In 1994, new owners bought it, gutted the interior, removed everything that reminded anyone of January 11, 1991. They opened a new restaurant with a different name, different decor, different everything, but old-timers never forgot what the building used to be. Some still cross the street rather than walk past that address. Boston's Chinatown changed after the massacre, though not in the ways people hoped. The immediate aftermath saw increased police presence, community meetings, promises of intervention programs to address gambling addiction. Boston PD established an Asian gang unit specifically to monitor organized crime in ethnic communities. The FBI increased surveillance of Ping An, operations up and down the East Coast. But the underground gambling continued. Different locations, more security, more careful screening of customers. But it continued because the demand was there and the culture supported it. And the economic desperation that drove people to gamble didn't change because 5 people had died. Within a year, new gambling dens operated in Chinatown, more discreet but just as active. The lesson learned wasn't that gambling was dangerous, it was that public violence was bad for business, so violence had to happen more privately. Detective James Doyle retired from Boston PD in 2005 after 36 years of service. In a 2018 interview for a true crime podcast, he reflected on the Tai Tung case. "It stayed with me. 5 people dead over $5,500. That's $1,100 per life, if you do the math. But it was never really about the money. It was about respect, about making an example, about maintaining order in a community where official law wasn't welcome. Nam Huynh gambled his way into a debt he couldn't pay. The Ping An crew came to collect. Things went wrong, and 5 families lost people they loved. There's no justice that brings those people back. We convicted 3 shooters, but the one who organized it is still out there somewhere, or dead. Either way, the families don't have closure. They just have memories and graves." Kenny Lamb remains incarcerated at MCI Shirley, a medium-security prison 40 miles west of Boston. He's 57 now, has been in prison for 34 years, will die there. He's never expressed remorse, never given interviews, maintains the shooting was justified enforcement that went wrong due to Nam Huynh's refusal to accept responsibility for his debt. In prison records, he's listed as a model inmate, no disciplinary violations, works in the prison kitchen, keeps to himself. Tommy Ngo, incarcerated at MCI Norfolk, has taken a different path. He became a Buddhist, studies meditation, has participated in restorative justice programs where he's met with families of violence victims, not his own victims, but others seeking to understand how young men become killers. In a 2015 prison interview, he said, "I was 22 years old, thought I was tough, thought violence made you respected. I killed people for a debt that wasn't even mine to collect. Now I'm 56. I've spent more than half my life in prison. Every day I wake up and remember Bobby Chin's face when I shot him. Every day I wish I could take it back. But you can't unfire a gun. You can't unkill someone. You just live with it forever." Michael Tran, the youngest at 21 when the shooting happened, has struggled most with incarceration. Multiple suicide attempts, years in psychiatric treatment, diagnosed with PTSD and depression. He's been transferred between prisons multiple times for his own safety. In 2020, he was granted a parole hearing after serving 29 years. He was denied. The board's decision noted, while the petitioner has shown remorse and engaged in extensive rehabilitation efforts, the severity of the crimes, 5 murders in a public setting, outweighs other considerations. Petition denied. Rehearing possible in 2030. Susan Lee, the waitress who identified the shooters and whose testimony helped convict them, left Boston in 1992. She'd received threats from community members who believed she'd violated the code of silence, who thought she should have protected the shooters rather than cooperating with police. She moved to Los Angeles, changed her name, finished college, works as an accountant. In a rare 2010 interview with an Asian American magazine, she said, "I did what I thought was right. 5 people were dead. Someone had to speak up, but the community saw it as betrayal. My parents lost their business because people stopped shopping there. We got threatening letters. Someone spray-painted 'snitch' on our door. Eventually, we had to leave. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed silent." Then I remember Sam Huang had 2 little daughters. Vincent Wu's parents lost their only son. "No, I don't regret testifying, but I regret that the community punished me for it." Boston's Asian American community remains divided about the shooting 3 decades later. Some see it as a cautionary tale about gambling addiction and the need for community resources to address mental health and addiction issues. Others see it as a case of young men doing what they'd been taught to do, enforcing debts in a community where official law was either absent or hostile, and being destroyed when things went wrong. In Chinatown, on the corner of Tyler and Beach Streets, there's a small memorial, not official, just a community effort from 2001, the 10th anniversary. 5 stones, each engraved with a name and dates: Nam Huynh, Wei Chen, Bobby Chin, Vincent Wu, Franklin Young, Sam Huang. The memorial is easy to miss, just stones on a corner, but it's there. On January 12th each year, people leave flowers, incense, small offerings. Families of the victims, community members who remember, and a few people who gamble at new underground dens and who pause at this memorial to remember what happens when debts can't be paid and violence becomes the only language anyone speaks. The question that haunted everyone involved, from police to families to witnesses to the shooters themselves, was simple and unanswerable. Where was the line? At what point did debt collection become murder? When did enforcement become execution? At what point did maintaining order in a community become massacring 5 people in front of witnesses? Dai Wong planned to collect a debt. Kenny Lam fired because Nam Huynh refused to comply. Tommy Ngo fired because Wei Chen reached for something that might have been a weapon. Michael Tran fired because Bobby Chin was running. Each individual decision made sense in the moment, flowed logically from the one before, But the cumulative effect was 5 deaths that nobody had planned and that everybody regretted. The uncomfortable truth is that underground economies create their own rules, and those rules work until they don't. Gambling dens operate because there's demand and because official law doesn't want to deal with them. Debts accumulate because credit is necessary to keep operations running. Enforcers collect debts because without enforcement, the entire system collapses. And sometimes enforcement requires violence because in communities where you can't call the police, violence is the only way to maintain order. But violence has its own logic, its own momentum. Once the first shot was fired, everything that followed had a terrible inevitability. Kenny Lamb pulled the trigger and couldn't unpull it. 23 seconds later, 5 people were dead or dying, and 4 young men had transformed from debt collectors into mass murderers. There's no satisfying moral to this story, no clear lesson except that gambling addiction destroys lives, that debts in underground economies are enforced brutally, that violence in enclosed spaces becomes chaos instantly, and that the line between enforcement and execution is thinner than anyone wants to acknowledge. Nam Huynh gambled his way into a debt he couldn't pay. The Ping An crew came to collect. Things went wrong in ways nobody predicted, and 5 people died, while 25 witnesses learned that some things you see can never be unseen, some traumas never heal, and some communities carry wounds that time doesn't close, just covers with layers of silence until everyone pretends they've forgotten what happened on Tyler Street on January 11th, 1991. If this story made you think about the price of gambling addiction, the violence of underground economies, and the impossible choices communities face when official systems fail them, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about crime, justice, and the communities that survive both. Comment below. Where do you think the line is between debt enforcement and murder? How should communities handle gambling addiction when official resources are absent? Because these questions aren't just historical. They're happening right now in communities across America where underground economies operate according to rules written in tradition and enforced with violence. Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're created one bad debt, one desperate decision, one moment of violence at a time, and the communities that survive them carry scars that never fully heal, just fade enough that we can pretend we've forgotten what happened when honor became horror and 23 seconds changed everything.